much. I was joking earlier about the weather and the warm welcome, but you've outdone the weather. Thank you. I'm honored. Very honored and very pleased to be here. As Linda said, I'm a great fan of the work that is being done here at the center. And so it was a pleasure to be able to come and speak with you today. I need to make a small warning, maybe two. One of them is that I'm going to take you to the very roots of what is still called Western civilization, with quotes and caveats. I would have thrown in the Eastern world as well, but we only have about 50 minutes. I will be painting in very broad strokes across more or less every discipline I have tampered with, being a jack of all trade and master of none. So I'm sure I will offend everyone in the audience who knows much more about specifics than I do. But I'm hoping that by doing that, there might be a broader picture painted that could be useful, if not simply provocative. So, keyboard. I assume this bit of American cultural imperialism is well known. This part of the world? Okay, so this is what I was thinking of when I first tried to think about what I would want to say here today. And I thought, oh, well, aren't I being clever? I'll use this phrase, good grief. And then discovered, no, I wasn't so clever after all, that a number of people have picked up on this phrase and put it to very good purpose. The kind of counseling and support that we need in these times when we lose loved ones. This phrase is being used in a number of places, and so it turns out, I think, to be quite useful. Broadly, I'm going to trip lightly over the following, talk a little bit about Scandinavia, and some research that's being done there, which is the area of research that I know the best, and some interesting things that are coming out of that. I will spend a fair amount of time towards the middle, actually, delving into the philosophical and religious studies dimensions of what I see going on, something new here. And I'll have a kind of intellectual whiplash. I hope it's not too difficult to follow. But yes, we've had death online before, but not really. No, we haven't had it online at all in interesting ways. And bam, the body strikes back. So if you're a Star Wars fan, you can start thinking of, strike back music. That would be fine. And then one last example from Scandinavia is the Digmex project and work by Amanda Lagerqvist, as a way of finally turning to last considerations of what I would like us to start calling the post-digital era. And I'll do that by talking about reading, writing, and sex bots. So I've kept sex to the last to kind of keep you awake and interested, and hope that works. That's the plan. So start with some work done by our colleagues Ulla Hod Segerstad and Dick Kasparowski. This is done in 2015, but it's part of a larger project. Are trigger warnings a big deal here? I mean that respectfully. Do you worry about trigger warnings at this kind of event? We're talking about death and sex. This is. It'll be okay. Okay. If you get nervous, just think about Woody Allen movies, because he did one along these lines as well. Many people have not been to Scandinavia, which is really a shame. But it is, they are among the most secular, rational societies in the world. They're also the most egalitarian in terms of income and property distribution. Gender equality, this is where I sound like a Norwegian patriot. But they are also highly secular, rational societies. So much so that whatever you make of Habermas and or his feminist critiques, I like them both. You can use the language of Habermas and the public sphere and feminist critiques of that, and people understand what you're talking about. It's encoded into the law, it's encoded into research, ethics, interesting things like that. Strong social welfare societies has the highest internet penetration rates because being a strong social welfare society, we got the internet quite early. But very secular. Only about 4 to 5% of people in Norway and Denmark will actually participate in religious services. And for the religious studies folk, If you interrogate them or look at the hymns, what you'll find out is it's not always terribly orthodox. There is a kind of panentheism, which may be a bit of a holdover from earlier pre-Christian traditions. In all seriousness, I love my Danish friends. I love my Danish friends. They can drive me nuts when they say, if I die. They don't say, when I die. They say, if I die. There's something strange going on here. More to be said. The point is to set up the problem. How do you grieve in this kind of society absent the sort of traditional religious and community support systems that we've known for however many hundreds of generations since the last ice age? That used to be the way we experience death and grief. And this is partly why Facebook and other social media have become important new platforms, particularly in the Scandinavian countries. Particularly in Norway, because it's a mountainous country, people are separated, and so forth. And Elizabeth Klastrup has pointed out that Facebook in particular has now become a kind of quasi-public sphere in which we can share our experiences of death and grieving. If you would like to see a map, I like maps a lot, particularly this one. It's from the World Values Survey. I would be very curious to see how much of this has purchase or relevance or analogy here. I've been to Ireland enough to know that I really like it. That probably shows I don't know you too well yet. But if you measure in terms of emphasizing individual self-realization, secular rational values, we are all but off the map. Here you are, below the United States, I'm sorry, in terms of more dominated by, or more respectful of, one could put it that way, traditional values, community values, religious values, and so forth, and simply because of economy, a little bit more concerned about survival rather than self-realization. So part of the point is, well, death and grief may be experienced quite differently here. I don't know. You tell me. One of the ways in which this is clear, at least up until about 5 or 10 years ago, is that death is a taboo. And for me as an outsider coming in, I thought this was very strange. We're secular rational people, we're adults, we understand facts, and so forth. Why can't we talk about death? And I still don't know quite the answer to that. Particularly the death of a child is, of course, the worst that any parent can possibly imagine. And so to discuss the death of a child, which in some ways is where you are absolutely most vulnerable and most in need of help and support and comfort, and yet that's the one thing you can talk least about. It's a terrible situation for parents who come to that context. So, we have social media. This is a text given by permission, used by permission with a mother, and you'll figure out the context. She's in the bathroom. I'm sorry, she's in a fitting room. Help, I'm shopping with my eldest daughter. She has to buy clothes for X's funeral. I'm going under. Heart is beating and tears are flowing. I'm in a fitting room writing to you. Feel I have to in order not to break down. It's so difficult. Why do we have to go through this? Miss my child so I don't think I'll be able to make it. Tomorrow is 2 long months since I hugged my beloved ex, and I can never do that again. How is it possible? How can a beloved person who was with me every day and who was so warm and wonderful be gone? I think I'm going crazy. We've all lost somebody. We may have not lost a child. I hope not. It is terrible. But now you have instant communication with your support group, and this is what has changed. What's striking about this quote, apart from the power of grief, is that it illustrates how digital and mobile technologies are used as resources for instantly reaching a community, which can bring support in such a desperate situation anytime, day or night, as long as there is need for it. This is a closed Facebook group. Research ethics on this is another story, but we'll save that for another day. So this seems to be breaking open what used to be very strong taboos, partly because these kinds of closed groups, as well as public attention to them, have changed the way attitudes express themselves. So this would be where I have to give a trigger warning in some places. This is a child, her name is Rose, who passed away at the age of 5, I believe because of a heart defect. The girl in the middle is her sister, who is encountering her sister as deceased, along with a friend. This picture was published in Denmark in 2015, and it won the year's Journalist Prize for the Best Picture. So something profound has happened in this culture, and it is very likely, or at least to some degree, tied into social media. The second example that I want to draw from are from a recent master's thesis. It will be online within a month or so by Astrid Löwen-Holte, called Grief 2.0, kind of a catchy title when you're talking about death, grieving in an online world. And she had the experience of a friend, an acquaintance dying when she was young, and discovering how all of this began to unfold on Facebook, including this interesting phenomenon of outpourings of both direct grief by close friends and relatives and sympathy grief, which is the grief of people who don't really know the person very well, but they want to express that this has impacted them. You might think of the Dianification effect. They want to express a feeling, but it doesn't really change their everyday life. So Astrid managed to interview about 10 people, both older and younger. For some reason, guys, we don't like to talk about that, do we? We just don't do that. She had a very hard time finding a male informant. She only found one, and the rest of her informants are female. So this is obviously a very limited study in that sense, but it's one of the first that I'm aware of. And she asked several different questions, including how does receiving this kind of support online compare with support received offline? Are there different patterns between younger people and older people? Digital natives versus those of us who came to this a little later, perhaps. Sherry Turkle's now well-known, probably well-established series of concerns that technology allows us to be alone together. That with all the wonderful connectivity and advantages that it brings, it may be de-skilling us in terms of our face-to-face communication. That's a concern. And perhaps most importantly for our purposes, how do informants feel about strangers writing on a Facebook memorial page or memorial sighting? I want to stress, I really do want to stress, that by and large her findings are very, very positive. Okay, so with all due respect to journalists, I know how journalism works, and this is the question I get: is the internet good or bad? Yes. Was this good or bad? I mean, it's a good way to start for the question. It's not a critique of journalism, but I will be focusing on negative experiences. But I want to stress there's a lot of positivity here that we don't want to lose sight of. What was striking to me is that it turned out it was the older folk who got the most out of this, not the younger folk. And more particularly, what was striking to me is it was the younger folk, the so-called digital natives, who found the experience of grieving online to be so off-putting. I'll give you some quotes in a second. So off-putting that they have quit Facebook. And they have gone back, in their words, to real life. I suspect if you are a young person in Ireland, getting off Facebook is social death. Is that approximately the case? Mm-hmm. So getting off Facebook is not an easy step. It's a remarkable, and certainly the case in Norway. So here is Sophie, 21, who lost her sister in 2011. The difference between Facebook and the real world is so significant. On Facebook, you can just press the like button, and you have showed people that you care. Or when someone likes something I posted, I feel that I've been given attention and recognition, like a comfort from a lot of people. Not necessarily all bad. But in real life, it doesn't work like that. I have intentionally been trying to move away from Facebook and be more focused on real life. This is not some 65-year-old man who's curmudgeonly saying, "Hi, I told you so." This is a digital native. This is remarkable, I think. In real life, it doesn't work like that. I have intentionally been trying to move away from Facebook and be more focused and so forth. The people who liked all my posts on Facebook might just look down and not even say hi when I pass them on the street. How's that for comfort and care? It's understandable. They find the situation uncomfortable, so they don't even bother to try. But this is one place where this was a pattern that she found that does seem to be consistent with Turkle's critique or Turkle's concerns, that we manage to hide from one another with our technologies, even while we are keeping in touch online. It's so different to talk to them, cry in front of them, and just lay there with my head on their lap rather than look at her memorial page to see if someone has written anything there that day. I was hiding on Facebook before. When I posted things there, I didn't have to talk about how I was doing. It was comfortable being on Facebook. Again, this is not all bad. I didn't have to face people's reaction when I talked about this. That was really hard for me to face. On Facebook, you don't see the people you're talking to, so it gets less scary. But I worked really hard to quit relying on Facebook and to start living in the real world again. Yes. Interestingly enough, it was the older people who found comfort. So 2 of her informants were parents who lost their child. They saw this as a nice gesture. For them, it was a way of sustaining the memory of their child. If you know people who are parents and they have lost a child, that's one of the most crucial therapeutic dimensions of things, is not letting the child be forgotten. And Facebook, interestingly enough, is a really good way to do that. But it was the younger people who are more skeptical about strangers who post messages to the deceased. It seems like they believe the strangers are only there to get attention themselves, whereas the older adults seem to find messages supported no matter who wrote them. So this may have something to do with the very distinct character of losing a child. I don't know. 10 interviews is not a lot of empirical data. At this point, you're supposed to say, excuse me, Dr. S., we've had the internet for 25 years or so in the public domain. Haven't we had death online before? Yes, good question, good point. But it's been different, at least so far as I know. And there are some examples. So I'll talk about examples from death casting, World of Warcraft, and then move into some subsequent domains. Death online as a celebratory performance, as a spectator sport. That we've had. We've had it for a while. So there is death casting. And this is the work of Yukari Seiko on death casting and the ethics of online imagery. Stockholm 2010, a young man is setting up to hang himself, and within 10 minutes after broadcasting this, starting the broadcast, he in fact dies. The video was archived, distributed over YouTube and other online depositories. You can still find it. So there's this digital trace. Of course, this is devastating to relatives, to friends who discover this, inadvertently sometimes. But the persistency of this Swedish death casting is remarkable, as she says. Once uploaded online, this private suicide, which otherwise would not see the light of day, has acquired an unprecedented global visibility and persistent presence as a new spectacle to be consumed over and over again. So those of you who are familiar with the notions of commodification, how we commodify ourselves, present ourselves in commodified fashion, which online venues can help do in interesting ways and important ways, death becomes a commodification. Your own death becomes a commodity sport, if you will. Not my sense of how to do things. Any World of Warcraft players, actual gamers? Nobody's going to admit it in an academic audience. Okay. We'll keep it short then. I think this is right. There was a very famous incident in 2006 when a member of a guild, in fact, died in the real world, and her guild from all around the world decided they would arrange a memorial service for her online. They started to do this, and another guild, the so-called Serenity Now Guild, crashed the event. The original folk planning this were not wearing their armor, and so they were easy targets. What do you think? Should we send in our best weapons and warriors to slaughter these people in the moment that they're trying to have a memorial service for a person who has really died? All those in favor? Just curious. I wouldn't raise my hand either. What was interesting was the debate. Thank you.
Just keep masks. What is the word of Warcraft?
I'm sorry, thank you. And anybody else, please do the same thing. If I refer to something you're not familiar with, please stop me. World of Warcraft is a massive multiplayer online game, and so it's played in a virtual world. You participate there in avatars, and then it has all the game functions. You acquire points and weapons and score by killing people and other clever things. Is that, and for those who actually know the game, is that a fairly, that'll do? Okay. I just read about this. The debate was divided, and some people were arguing, and this is really the important point. Look, it's virtual, it's not real. It's not going to hurt anything. And as long as we assume there's a very, very clear and solid boundary between the virtual and the real, that argument has purchase. There are other ways of defending it as well, but that's the point I want to focus on. Because other people said, no, I'm sorry. And this will be one way of thinking about virtue ethics. In virtue ethics traditions, you are what you practice. You are what you practice. And if you're practicing assaulting people grieving at a funeral, even if it's virtual, maybe you're doing something for yourself that is not the most optimal. That's a question. Another way we have absolutely not had death online, and this will take us back to some of the earliest ways of conceiving about cyberspace, is that broadly speaking, for about 20 years or so, we had this profoundly dualistic in both religious and philosophical terms. And by dualism here, I mean something like, and I'll come back to Descartes soon, but dualism like virtual here, real there, no connection. Mind here, body there, no connection. That kind of dualism or opposition shaped a good deal of the discourse and even some of the early research in cyberspace and the digital very early on, and in such a way as to deny mortality, deny real mortality. There's a way in which it's a kind of grand conspiracy to deny mortality. If I die. So how many people know the novel by William Gibson, Neuromancer? A few people? Okay, great. We're all getting old, aren't we? Yeah, okay. It's a good novel, you should read it. But it's the Bible of cyberspace. And I use that word carefully because it is profoundly biblical. Case is the main cowboy or hacker in the novel. And he is attacked by a kind of virus that slows his synapses down and so forth. And when this happens, interestingly enough, it is put in strictly Augustinian original sin terms. So I suspect that in a primarily Catholic country, I don't have to explain original sin, but for the one or two people who may not recall it, original sin, as we'll see in a bit, is a doctrine that comes from St. Augustine. I'll give you a little bit more detail, I think. So now Case is no longer able to fly in cyberspace in the ways he had done before, and the language is this. For Case, who lived in the bodiless exaltation of cyberspace, it was the fall. Capital F. I did not make that up. That's his language. In the bars he'd frequented as a cowboy hotshot, the elite stance involved a certain relaxed contempt for the flesh. The body was meat. Case fell into the prison of his own flesh. So, I taught liberal arts undergraduate education for a really long time, and I deeply believe in liberal arts education, and I am absolutely convinced we should all read the Confessions, because it is a high water mark of the exploration of individual subjectivity that pushes us forward in really important and interesting ways. That said, I'm not so excited about Augustine's reinterpretation of the Genesis story, second Genesis story, as a fall. But Augustine read that story in a way that still influences a lot of people, even William Gibson. That somehow or another this was a fall from a kind of pre-sexual childhood innocence by way of original sin, the original sin of human disobedience. This didn't come out of the blue. It goes back to Greek and specifically Gnostic beliefs in the soul as a kind of pure spark that fell from a disembodied heaven into the material world, precisely the prison that Gibson describes. Please note, and this is the critical point in a certain way, what this leads to is a demonization of women, body, and sexuality. A demonization of women, body, and sexuality, because the woman was the one who got us into a world, post-paradisical status in which we have to work and we have to die. Thank you very much. Your fault. I don't know if there are any medieval art historians, but what's interesting is that this demonization was so profound that the snake, also sort of reconceptualized in terms of Satan, is female. It's a common genre in the Middle Ages. And we see this back in Neuromancer. An artificial intelligence attempts to distract, more precisely seduce, Case from his primary mission by constructing an alternative space inhabited by a former girlfriend. Just as the woman, as reinterpreted by Augustine, is the sexual temptress who thereby occasioned the man's fault, so Case's former girlfriend tempts him back to the body qua mead. There's this lovely passage. There was a strength that ran in her, something he'd known in Night City and held there, been held by it, held for a while, away from time and death. It belonged, he knew, he remembered, as she pulled him down to the meat, the flesh the cowboys mocked. It was a vast thing beyond knowing, a sea of information coded in spiral and pheromone, infinite intricacy that only the body in its strong, blind way could ever read. So we have a little bit of ambiguity. Those of you who know this history will recognize that dualism was taken up in strong ways and to some degree for good reasons. So Donna Haraway, in 1990, her Cyborg Manifesto, wants to exploit this sharp boundary between the virtual and the real in favor of women and their freedom. What she saw in this kind of disembodied cyberspace was a perfectly understandable, perfectly desirable possibility of escaping the exploitation of and discrimination that women experience as a result of their objectified existence in meat space. So makes some sense. But if you go through the rest of sort of the more popular discourse in the 1990s, Harold Reingold is all ecstatic about a virtual community separate from real communities. Alvin Toffler goes further, and for the philosophers interested in metaphysics and ontology, this is what happened in the 20th century. Matter is overthrown. I hope everyone feels very good about that. Keep paying attention to this word matter. It will come back. And then finally, a kind of high water mark. John Perry Barlow's infamous declaration of independence of cyberspace. Cyberspace consists of transactions, relationships, and thought itself, arrayed like a standing wave in the web of our communications. Ours is a world that is both everywhere but nowhere, but it is not where bodies live. Your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply to us. They are based on matter, and there is no matter here. Our identities have no bodies. So unlike you, we cannot obtain order by social coercion. Some of you know about transhumanism. This, in science fiction terms, is the scenario of a brain in a vat. But this kind of notion creeps in there and starts as early as 1988. Gee, maybe we could download consciousness into a sufficiently sophisticated computer system, mind children, and thereby become immortal. Please pay attention to that. Become immortal because we are cut off from an embodied existence, cut off from our bodies. So Ray Kurzweil, who from my perspective is not taken seriously by any philosopher in these matters, but nonetheless is taken seriously by Google as their chief technologist, this is his argument. And if you don't know of it, this is roughly how it works. It's an exercise in technological determinism. But by approximately 2030, everything will collapse into the singularity. Computer processing, artificial intelligence, and we will all be welcoming our artificial intelligent overlords. And hope that they figure out how to treat us kindly. Or if we're as fortunate as Kurzweil hopes, give us immortality. There was, of course, pushback from this very early on, starting with the work of Alekir Rosanne Stone already in 1990. She's not a philosopher, but she knows Descartes. Forgetting about the body is an old Cartesian trick, one that has unpleasant consequences for those bodies whose speech is silenced by the act of our forgetting. This is to say, those upon whose labor the act of forgetting the body is founded, usually women and minorities. However powerful Haraway's version of liberation from the body may be, this powerful and productive strategy has its dangers. Catherine Hales, by the end of the 1990s, takes us to a critique of Norbert Wiener's conception of cybernetics. I like Wiener's work a lot, not only because of what it does for cybernetics, but also what it does for ethics in the computer world. But Hales sees in there a dualism, yet once again, that she thinks needs to be corrected. And so she talks about her dream of the post-human, one that embraces the possibility of information technologies without being seduced by fantasies of unlimited power and disembodied immortality. One that recognizes and celebrates finitude. Welcome back to mortality, to finitude. Mortality means finitude. As a condition of human being, and that understands human life is embedded in a material world of great complexity. The body strikes back. If we take an even broader approach, and this is where I will probably offend anybody who loves your technologies and wants to build your technology. I don't want to offend you, but I want to raise a question. And then I'll compare how many computers you have with how many I have. You can run yours better, but we'll see. We don't often pay attention to this, but in the history of philosophy of science, Bacon is acknowledged as starting us in a new direction in genuinely modern technology. Very pragmatic aim. And what most of us have forgotten because we haven't read is this is, again, Augustinian, except in reverse. He wants to overcome the fall. He wants to overcome the fall. So he says, for man by the fall fell at the same time from his state of innocency and from his dominion over creation. Both of these losses, however, can even in this life be in some part repaired, the former by religion and faith, the latter by arts and sciences. Arts and sciences are going to restore our dominion over nature. Descartes, who was trained in an Augustinian university, wrote in a way that got him in a lot of trouble, but that we don't seem to worry about quite so much anymore. He wants to have a progress in science and technology as we become masters and possessors of nature. But what's interesting are the two aims of this technology. One is the invention of an infinity of arts and crafts which enable us to enjoy without any trouble, sans aucune peine, the fruits of the earth and all the good things which are to be found there. Okay, that sounds good. I'm in. Even better, the preservation of health through medicine with the hope that we could be free of an infinitude of maladies, both of body and mind, and also even possibly of the infirmities of age. I like that. I like it a lot. But read it against the Augustinian background. Labor and death, and pain and childbirth, which Descartes overlooks because he probably, as a male, was not too concerned about it, are the hallmarks of the human condition since the fall. You read it in that background, as his Catholic readers did at the time, and they accuse him of blasphemy because he's trying to use technology to overturn what, in that traditional Orthodox reading, are justified punishments for putative disobedience. And then we come back to transhumanism. We will be gods, we will be immortal through our own technologies. So it's an old trope in a lot of ways. What I'm after is that as we start to have these experiences of death coming back, if you will, becoming real for us in online environments, we can start to have a larger conversation, raise larger questions of an existential sort. And this is being done by this project run by Amanda Lagerqvist called Existential Terrains, which has been going for about a year and a half or so. And one of its focuses is the experience of death in a digital era. How do we deal with that? She has recently introduced the idea of an existential media studies. She observes our digitally enforced life world is an existential and ambivalent terrain. Questions concerning digital technologies are thus questions about human existence. She proposes an existential media analysis that accounts for the thrownness. What does thrownness mean? It means we're caught. We're thrown into a world we didn't ask to be, but here we are. We're in a classic existential, I think, human set of themes. We have to face death. We have to face the reality of time. We are in a context, in Heideggerian terms, being in and with the world. This is stuff that is now coming to become more of a set of questions for media studies. She draws on Karl Jasper's notion of the limit situations, Grenzesituation. If your German's a little rusty, what that means is you are pushed to the limit. Think of the mother in the fitting room. You are pushed to the limit by the death of your child. Nobody wants to be there. The only good thing that can be said about it, though, is in those situations we start to recognize things about ourselves and those around us that we would otherwise not understand or appreciate. Our human vulnerability is principally felt and our security is shaken. So she wants to trade this term that we use so much, the user, or even a savvy user. In place of a savvy user, she wants to talk about an exister. The principal subject in media studies, an inhabitant of a digital ecology, a stumbling, hurting, and relational human being who navigates within limits and among interruptions through the torrents of our digital existence in search for meaning and existential security. So this is quite far away from Kurzweilian immortality as a brain in a computerized vat, as I hope is fairly clear. There will be other ways of raising these kinds of existential questions. I'll talk in a minute about completeness, which is an old theme from phenomenology and care ethics, virtue ethics. There are other existential questions that might be relevant or interesting, notions of authenticity. I'm a big fan of Friedrich Nietzsche's critique of dualism, as you might have gathered. He calls dualism the metaphysics of the hangman. And if there's time, we can talk about that. And his alternative is that we have to turn away from the demonization of body, sexuality, women, and the world that we live in, especially when we image nature as female, into affirmation of the goodness of this life. And so for those of you who know Luciano Floridi's philosophy of information and information ethics, you will find that at work there, drawing from a number of sources. So, I would like to suggest that we drop the term digital, even though it's handy and we know what we mean by it and so forth, and start talking about a post-digital, or at least keep this in mind. Again, this is not anything novel on my part. This is partly suggested by David Barry, who in turn points to an article by 2000. And all that we're trying to say with this is that the digital and the analog, they're not this old dualism of the virtual versus the real. The two are inextricably interwoven, as Catherine Hales suggests. Of course, the computational is hegemonic. The digital is understood as a historic moment, defined in opposition to the analog. But rather than talking about digital versus analog, let's talk about them as modulations, different intensities, as a kind of spectrum. What's going on where? Where is more digital? Where is it more analog? And I think we see this in a lot of ways. My heart goes pity-pat in terms of trying to teach people how to write. Liberal arts tradition. So there's some really interesting research out there coming along. One most recently, so this is Wired Magazine. And this is last year. This is so 2015. Wired magazine is telling us, you know, the smart reading device of the future may be paper. Why? Because you don't have to boot it up. And there are cognitive effects that occur when you engage with your body in a mechanical or an analog environment that don't take place in a digital environment, as good as those can be. This is one of the most recent studies I've run into with a lovely title, "Only 3 Fingers Write, but the Whole Brain Works. Is the pen mightier than the word?" And again, what it finds is that when you activate your body by actually writing, or you can this can be a pen on a digital pad, it doesn't matter. There's something that happens with the engagement of the whole body and the brain that increases concentration, recollection, and all those things that we like to emphasize, including greater capacity to build complex conceptual relationships. So I think some things are happening to suggest that the body's coming back. Most specifically, social robots. And they're a really interesting site for trying to interrogate these things. First of all, because robots are embodied. They're requiring us to bring these systems into an embodied form. And what that means is a kind of increasing recognition of the central importance of embodiment in human being existence and communication. So they're test beds, I think, where we can explore more fine-grained understandings of this complex matrix of what makes us human. How much of that can we realize, replicate in our devices, and how much might not be replicated in our devices? Again, this is a very old trope. You might recognize this robot from Fritz Lang's Metropolis. I don't know why it is, but when we men build robots, they look like young women. Something going on here. And there's more to be said about that. For the Trekkies or Trekkers in the world, this is first season Star Trek, where a research scientist is transformed to an android in order to save his life, which is really great. But then he creates an android who looks suspiciously like a beautiful young woman. Go figure. But there's very good and serious dialogue in here about, can we retain our human capacities as we become, we might say, cyborgs? And this is not just Star Trek. So Wyndham Wallach, who's one of the leading folk in robot philosophy or machine ethics, makes exactly the same point, that by looking at AI and humanoid robots, it forces us to better understand or deeply think about the ways in which we are similar and perhaps will stay different from the artificial entities that we will create. Again, it's a very old trope. So this is Pygmalion, the Greek sculptor who, dissatisfied with the local women, sculpted his own beautiful object, and Aphrodite obligingly brought it to life. I'm going to suggest that there may be sex here, but not eros. And this will be the last bit. So this is a social robot called Pyro. It's a baby harp seal. It is used in therapy, particularly for older folk. I'm sure I'm going to get one in a few years. It's very effective, especially for people with dementia. It acts like it cares for you, and it evokes care. This one is a little spookier. It's called a telenoid. It looks like Casper the Ghost from my days. But it is an embodied form of communication that also turns out to be quite effective. Some of you may know that Dan Levy in 2007 wrote a book called Love, Sex, and Robots. At the time, people said, yeah, sure. But we're getting closer. Maybe. I have to show you this slide because the first time I showed this slide, one of my friends in the audience said, "Which one is the robot?" And I thought, that was a really funny question. And the longer that I've worked on this, the more I realized, that's exactly the question, as I will try to show you here fairly quickly. So I'm drawing on more recent work on social robots. But I was surprised. Right now, according to that very reliable source, The Mirror, sex bots are the biggest trend of 2016. And you certainly can find a lot more journalism, good journalism and otherwise, out there. But look at how it's couched. More lonely humans seek mechanical companions. Okay? There's a wonderful article that I wish everyone could get to read, but you have to be very patient because it's thick grained phenomenology as well as virtue ethics by Sarah Ruddick in 1975. It's called Better Sex. Some of you may know Ruddick's work because she's usually credited as founding care ethics, among other things. And what's remarkable about this article, among other things, is that we have a very sensitive and careful account of sexuality from a woman's perspective, which in 1975 was still a little bit rare. And by looking at this, I would suggest we will learn some important things. First of all, she emphasizes embodiment. A sense of embodiment that we know, for example, from experiences in sport in which there is no longer a sense of separation between mind and body. Descartes goes away. We're no longer aware of ourselves as mind somehow driving our bodies. We enjoy the experience of complete embodiment. The self or subject is fully intermeshed with all the body is engaged in. In these experiences, we are our bodies. So she distinguishes between good sex, better sex, and complete sex. And the characteristics include these. The partner actively desires another person's desire. It's not just enough to desire the other. We desire that the other desire us. What that also means is it requires the actively desiring person, it commits the actively desiring person to her desire and requires her to identify with it. That is, to recognize herself as a sexual agent as well as respondent. Again, in 1975, this was kind of exciting stuff for the second wave feminism. Women as sexual agents. What an idea. Moreover, this embodied sexual agency is mutual. In complete sex, desire is recognized by responding and active desire. Given responding desire, both people identify themselves as sexually desiring the other. There's a mutuality of desire that leads to an understanding of persons as equals. Persons as equals. This means that it is reciprocal, but there's also relationships of equality. So for Ruddick, when this occurs, and the first time I did this in a lecture, my women friends said, "I'm sorry I lost you there because I was trying to figure out if I'd ever had this experience." I'm sorry if I distracted you. She's not saying this happens all the time, of course, and she's not saying it's the only way that there can be good sex. But when it does occur, what's important about it is that it has certain ethical dimensions to it. It involves respect for persons, a virtue of respect, and love itself emerges on this analysis as a virtue. Not simply a passion, something that happens to us, which is wonderful when it happens, but a virtue that we have to practice in certain ways, especially as it involves respect for persons. You don't have to hear from me that this is complicated precisely in the context of sexuality. Sexuality is such, in most, at least in many cases, that it's more easy, it's very tempting to treat the other rather as an object for my ends instead of as a full person. But that's exactly what complete sex involves, is respect for and protecting the autonomy of the other. Pretty high bar for this kind of thing. There are other aspects that go on here. There are discussions about artificial autonomy, artificial emotions, artificial agency, and responsibility. But to step out of this, so far as I have been able to gather, one of the things that we are likely not to be able to do with an AI is to create a sense of first-person phenomenal consciousness. A sense of self that is capable of reflecting on itself. So for example, when Watson beat the Go player, phenomenal, impressive achievement. But there was no self inside of Watson saying, "Ah, I know what I'm doing. Ah, I see the next move. Ah, oh dear, look what this person has done." That doesn't exist. There's no self-consciousness there. There's no first-person consciousness there. There's no first-person consciousness interactive with its own body. We also can't build emotions. This has become a consensus in the robotics community, at least in the last 10 years. We're very good at artificial emotions. We can create devices that act like they care for us with gaze and voice and tone and gesture, and it's great because it fools us, and sometimes it's useful to be fooled. But, as Brinkshort puts it, AIs, robots, and so on are all zombies. as good as they may be at faking it, and as therapeutic as that can be, for example, in the case of the harp seal, we're still dealing with a zombie. No first-person consciousness, no desire, no emotion. And this means then you could have good sex, maybe, with a robot zombie, but not complete sex, because you would lack the capacities for mutuality of desire as well as respect for personhood and autonomy. This means, though, that in a certain way that if we think it's important, and maybe we don't, I really don't know, but if we think it's important to somehow remain distinct from robots, as much fun as we're having building them. I don't have a slide for this, but I'm very excited because I'm now on a 5-year project. We're going to be building robots, and we're going to be building robots with Hiroshi Ishiguro. This is cool stuff! Sorry, it's a technical academic term. Right? This is very cool stuff. But from a virtue ethics perspective, if we want to remain human, then in a certain way we have to practice. We have to cultivate certain virtues. And that's why this question was so pertinent in the end. If all we have is sex with robots, there's a way in which we will perhaps unlearn or never learn the skills and capacities we need to be friends, to communicate well, to be intimate partners over a long-term relationship. We have to cultivate those virtues. So coming to the end, this is not just in a few places. There's a kind of larger renaissance of virtue ethics for embodied human beings as mortal, vulnerable, incomplete, and insecure. So Shannon Valor has been a leader in this. She now has a new book from Oxford University Press on technology and the virtues. John Sullins is suggesting that we use virtue ethics to train robots. So a robot built in Orvis, where I sometimes go for these things, is trainable. It learns from human beings, and so the cartoon is that the good Danish guy is teaching the robot the basic Danish virtues of drinking beer and watching TV. This is very important. His partner is a little concerned and says that she should take over the training of the robot, and he doesn't understand. He says, "What? What? What for that? Why?" So we may have those scenes coming up. I don't know. This shows up in other literature on IT innovation by Sarah Spiekerman, for example, and then most amazingly, the article that we looked at yesterday for the Sandow Research Ethics. This is not a philosopher. This is a computer science. Bindert Zevenbergen has been spending 2 years with other computer scientists trying to figure out what should our ethics be. And he's come to the conclusion with his colleagues, we need virtue ethics. Virtue ethics should be applied to internet research and engineering, where the technical persons must fulfill the character traits of a virtuous agent. If you were here last spring, you got to hear Peter Paul Verbeek, terrific, terrific lecture, but he is also helping us go in these directions. So in some ways, what is old is new again, perhaps. If you haven't read the Epic of Gilgamesh, you should. It's the oldest epic we have. It's very, very difficult to read. But once you figure it out, I think it's very profound and moving. Gilgamesh is a warrior. He loses his best friend to death, and he decides he will find eternal life. He encounters Siduri, the goddess of wine, who delivers the wisdom message of the text. Gilgamesh, where are you hurrying to? You will never find that life for which you are looking. When the gods created man, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping. As for you, Gilgamesh, fill your belly with good things day and night, night and day. Dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh, bathe yourself in water. Cherish the little child that holds your hand. Gilgamesh was a warrior. He was the baddest ass warrior in the day. And for him to learn that you take care of children instead of exploiting them is his wisdom that he needs. Make your wife happy in your embrace. Don't exploit her. Don't objectify her. Don't use her. Make her happy in your embrace. For this too is the lot of man. This was good enough that it was cribbed into Ecclesiastes, for those of you who would like to see that text. But to end simply with Snoopy wisdom. Someday we will all die. Yes? But on the other days we will not. So I wish you good lives and good grief. 1,000 thanks. Good journey. Go tour. thank you so much for your attention and patience, and I look forward to conversation. Thank you.